That's your main job as a horror writer. How to fuck with people.
This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter. Here is part 2 of my discussion with Nat Cassidy, author of Nestlings. Can you tell me a bit about Steal the Stars?
Yeah, Steal the Stars that was a really fun project. That was really fortuitous timing because at the same time I was doing horror theater, and there are some very close friends of mine who had a theater company, still do, and they were mainly doing like sci-fi theater. They're really fucking great at it. Like they were kind of the sci-fi theater company of downtown New York theater. But we were kind of on similar emotional journeys. Like we were all just kind of burned out from theater, and like we had successes and plenty of failures, but like even the successes like weren't paying the sort of dividends you need to like live in New York City. And it was just like, it was such a drag to like keep butting up against the business realities of producing plays and writing plays. And the main writer of that company is a writer named Mac Rogers, brilliant sci-fi writer and other stuff, but like sci-fi is like his wheelhouse. But he had like just started making a name for himself also in audio dramas. So this would be like 2016 or so, and audio dramas were still relatively rare at this point, like at least as far as podcasts were going. 2015, 2016, like there definitely wasn't the glut that there is now. There were very few of them, and he wrote two really prominent ones, The Message and Life After. And those had done really well, millions of downloads, so Mac was starting to get really comfortable writing in that space. And the rest of us, his compatriots in that theater company and me, were also like really getting intrigued by the genre potential of audio dramas. And we decided to basically form a company to write and produce audio dramas. And at the same time, Tor, the publishers, Tor Books, who were based in New York City at the time, they were in the Flatiron Building, and they used to come and see our plays all the time. And they'd be like, "We fucking love your guys' work. Obviously, we publish books, not plays, so like we're useless to you as like a contact or anything like that. But we're just big fans." And Mac and I both like grew up reading Tor books, so we were like, "Oh my god, just sitting down with you and chatting is like blowing our minds. Like it's amazing. We love Tor." But around the same time, Tor was also like, "We're thinking of branching out into something multimedia and like audio dramas or something like that." So we all had a conversation together, and we basically did a co-production of an original audio drama, serialized audio drama, 14 episodes. And we decided to go with one of the scripts that Mac was working on because it was so fucking good. It's this like doomed noir sci-fi romance sort of vibe set in a secret military installation where you're not allowed to fraternize with your peers, but these two security guards fall in love, and the thing that they are holding in this secret installation is the one crashed and surviving spaceship. And so they're like, "We can't date, but we really want to date. We're in love with each other. How can we start our lives?" They decide to steal the alien body that is inside that spaceship and like sell it and live on the run. So it's basically like a reverse heist of people who work in the place that they are heisting. It was just like such a great premise for like a serialized story too. One of the things that Tor mentioned in our co-producing deal was they're like, since obviously we're a book publisher and we want to promote the hell out of this thing, like we're thinking of doing like a novelization of the podcast as well, to basically be released concurrent with the last episode of the podcast so that people can read the story too. And because I was in this moment where I was like, I really want to start writing books, this wasn't part of the deal, but they basically offered it to us first. So like, if any of you are interested in it, speak now. And I was like, I'm interested. I would love to give this a try, because I love adapting. And especially since I hadn't written a full-length novel as like an adult, I find that adaptation is is a great like training wheels exercise. My first play was an adaptation. It was kind of very similar. I got comfortable with the language of playwriting because I didn't have to worry about the story as much. And so this seemed like a good opportunity to kind of reacquaint myself with writing a novel. And they had me write like a 15,000 word audition, essentially. And I did. And they were like, great, we love it. You can write the novel. At the time, Mac had only written like 3 of the scripts. So I was novelizing him like in real time, where he would write a script. And I was also helping produce it, and I was in it. So it would literally just be like me in the booth with Mac and Sean, who was producing as well. Jordana was directing. And like Mac would like finish a script and give it to all 3 of us. I would highlight my lines, and then I would like novelize the script. And then we would record it, and then we would edit it. It was crazy. Like it all from first draft to publication, I think it was like 6 months. It happened so fast.
Wow.
Because like we had no time, and we were doing a show the whole time too. But it's great. I'm really proud of it. It's one of those things that happened so fast that like I have very little emotional attachment to my own creative choices, because it happened like so fast that like I could probably read it as a reader and not even as a writer, because it was such a frantic endeavor. But there are like passages in it every now and then, like if someone on like Goodreads highlights it or something like that, where I'm like, fuck, that's really good. Like, good job. I really like that. Since I didn't create it, I feel like I can objectively say like it's really fucking good. I'm really glad it exists.
And they're both still available, the audio drama and the book.
Yeah, available as an ebook if you want to read the novelization. And then there's actually a great package on Audible right now where you can get the entire audio drama and the prequel that we did. So yeah, I highly recommend it.
That is a wild story about brushing up against Tor and then falling into this opportunity.
Yeah, I sometimes feel kind of self-conscious about it because I, in a way, fell ass backwards into being a published author. And I know so many people who are like still waiting for that first publication or like an in with a publisher. So like on some level, there's part of me that almost feels embarrassed by this indirect route, which then became my in with Nightfire as well.
Embarrassed by doing a shit ton of work in mounting productions in New York that Tor loved, and being ready to form a company and produce audio dramas and read.
That's the other side of it. It's like I spent fucking like 10 to 15 years busting my ass as a writer and like not being able to get anyone to cover us. And, you know, the New York Times literally walking out on my one-man show and like trying to get an agent and not being able to get an agent for years. So I do find it to be a valid and worthwhile story to be honest and you know, in full detail with other writers and people about, because like sometimes it really does go to show that like just keep doing what you're doing. Even if it doesn't happen in the way you think it's going to happen, like opportunities that you cannot predict open up and will take you down the path that you're trying to get down anyway. So it's a good lesson that I also like try and remind myself as I get frustrated with how, you know, hard it is to make any professional progress in any sort of artistic endeavor. Shit happens and you just got to like keep going and prepare for it.
Words of encouragement, well timed. Are you ready to get into Nestlings?
Oh yeah, let's get into it.
Nestlings could be categorized as a vampire story, but these ain't your daddy's vampires. This is a very different approach to the material. So different, in fact, that I, a dyed-in-the-wool vampire obsessive, didn't clock that I was wandering into a vampire story. And that was just the best surprise I could have gotten.
I love that. Yeah, I wanted the book, because I already wrote it, to kind of work on 2 levels. One, like the immediate experiential level where you don't know what's happening, and then to also have a few more twists up its sleeve even after the kind of more premise-y twist gets revealed, to still go in places where like you cannot predict where it's going, but then also to have a great reread value. That was one of the many things that I took from Salem's Lot, actually. I think one of the things Salem's Lot does so well, though even the way they marketed it originally, was that you didn't know it was going to involve vampires at all. And it takes a long time for the vampire action to kick in. Like it's just this, as King has described it, just kind of this Peyton Place sort of drama of a small town and all the various corruptions at foot within it. So when the vampire stuff starts happening, it almost feels like a genre shift. And Nestlings, I'm attempting to do something very similar. And so it's very gratifying to hear you say that, because obviously we have to market it. There are some elements we have to mention. there's a market for vampire novels. So like we want to be upfront so that people who enjoy vampire or vampire adjacent stories can find this book. But even then, it's not going to happen the way I think a traditional vampire story is going to happen. And these are not traditional vampires at all. These are not Bela Lugosi's wandering around with two plastic fangs sticking out of their mouth. It's very much its own thing.
Your sentences are very playful and they rub off of each other in interesting ways. This is a tangent that I skipped over in the interest of time, but it is relevant to Nestlings. Did you ever read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics?
No.
Brilliant book deconstructing the theory of sequential art.
Interesting.
Very early on, he shows a frame that might be typical of an old EC horror comic where you've got the madman raising the hatchet above a woman and she's screaming and the scream fades out. You could add the next panel where you see him holding up her severed head. But that lets the audience off easy because she's dead. It's over. When you don't show the murder and you just draw your box around the hatchet approaching the screaming woman, you suspend her in that limbo for all eternity. In your mind, that is a hanging thread. Like when you were a child and you walked in on Alien, you're like, I have to know how this ends, or else it's just going to keep coming back.
Yeah.
In Nestlings, you are running these stories in parallel and they overlap in such a way. In fact, the theme or the structure of overlap plays out in the characters' lives, in their traumas, in architecture, over and over and over again in ways that create this dramatic tension and dramatic irony, where one character will know something the other doesn't. The audience knows something, the characters don't. There is one moment where there's a character at a swanky cocktail party, and you have left this open tab of something horrific happening to another character. And we don't know what's going to happen to her because we cut to this cocktail party. But just like Hitchcock with a bomb under the table, you can't enjoy this cocktail party because you know that this other character is in peril. And then you just stick in a line, just a little button at the end of the chapter. And it's at that moment, other character is screaming. And it just, it's the bitter and the sweet. The whole thing, you're mixing the bitter and the sweet together, and it is, chef's kiss.
Oh, thank you. And that is very much a side effect of consuming so much Stephen King. Like that is a Stephen King sort of move. Like I can remember, God, it might have been Cujo or one of the books that I read very, very early on, where it's almost a Stephen King cliche where like he ends a chapter with like, and that was the last time he ever saw them alive or something like that. And you're like, what? No. And you just like have to, and then like we'll go off on a tangent in the next chapter and you're like, oh, I got to get back to this. I love that. I love it. It's interestingly related to, your earlier question of how like playwriting and Shakespeare and stuff like that informs novel writing and also the development of the one-man show and stuff like that, because it's all interrelated. I very much feel like when you are creating something for a medium, a specific thing for a medium, that medium has its own language that you should embrace and kind of judo style writing, like use it to propel it further away. So yeah, like things with chapter breaks and like narrative reference and stuff like that. Like I love finding ways to have those matter and mean something because you're writing a book. So you might as well use the language that writing a book gives you. Similarly, when you're making a movie, like match cuts I fucking love. Like if you can have one thing in one scene just kind of dissolve into another location and just kind of bridge that gap, and not use it arbitrarily, but find a reason to use it. There's just nothing more satisfying than when a story told in a medium uses that medium and like acknowledges it in a way that enriches the experience.
An easy example of how you do this in Nestlings is the book is divided into sections. Each of them are broken down into very short chapters, and you commit to naming each chapter. And that can be an ironic title, it can be a warning, it can be a punchline, but you are playing with the structure and format of the chapters and of novels over and over. There's a chapter you have where it's just pure dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
There's a chapter you have called Mantras where each character focuses on a single phrase. And by breaking it into these little chapters, you can play with the language and structure of the novel. It just makes the book such a breeze to read, such a great experience.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear that. Thank you. You have to find these ways to make the medium count. As a writer, you have to make sure you know the experience you're giving your given audience and how to fuck with them. That's your main job as a horror writer, how to fuck with people.
The fine art of fuckology. Last line I want to call out from the body of the novel itself. Just something that almost made me put the book down just to take a beat. When a body falls from a great height, you might think that it ruptures or bursts. To an extent, it does. But there are already all sorts of holes and egresses. So really, what happens is everything gets ejected. A great turning out of the pockets. You become a yard sale for all you really own. It was so graphic and literally visceral. It just landed. And it was sardonic, but had the awful ring of truth like good sardonic dialogue does. And I was just like, oh, that one hit me, man. That was a brutal line. Bravo.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of recurrent imagery in the book of falling, of plummeting, of hitting the ground from a great height. That was nice to be able to articulate it in that way, because it made me think of those like squeezy toys where you squeeze them and like the eyes
poke out. Yeah.
It was like, that's what happens when you hit hydrostatic pressure.
The average horror writer frets about cell phones, makes them lose signal or battery, or they'll set something in the past because they're worried about trying to preserve isolation, which is so crucial for horror. You set Nestlings literally in the here and now, and you have created profound isolation with all of these overlapping traumas, secrets, and lies. The confidence with which you're just like, yeah, have Google, have your cell phones. Google's not going to save you. There's no one you can call. Call the police. Go ahead. No one is coming to save you. You know, your protagonist is in a wheelchair, and none of this information is going to help her. Once she makes that fatal flaw of agreeing to live on the upper echelons of a skyscraper, she's sealed her fate. To take a rare moment of optimism from your protagonist and then use that like a knife against her for the rest of the story, to just torture her and twist that knife over and over again. It's so savage. It's so brutal what you do to these characters. It's such a ride you take us on. It's really awesome. What was your inspiration for coming at this vampire adjacent style monster?
This is one of the reasons why we kind of like had to acknowledge that it's a vampire story or a vampire adjacent story, because it's hard to talk about without bringing this element into it. But it's very much a Jewish story. And the protagonists are Jewish. They're Reformed. So, they're kind of lax in how they observe Judaism, but like they're culturally Jewish insofar as they have a religion, they're religiously Jewish. And that very much informs the emotional landscape of the story. So even from the earliest imaginings of this book, I knew I wanted to tell a Jewish version of a classic vampire story. I love vampire stories. I've grown up reading them. But as someone who's been Jewish my whole life, there's something about vampire stories too, that whenever like the crucifix works, like, okay. Like some vampire stories will go out of their way to say all holy artifacts work, or like it's just the belief behind the artifact or something like that. But there are plenty that are just like, no, the cross works. Like vampires just hate crucifixes. And when you're not a Christian, there is just part of you that's like, what would I do in that scenario? Like, would it work for me? And B, would that throw me into a tailspin? What does that mean? What does that mean to the culture I was raised into, and the belief system that is, for me, as natural as breathing? And there's one vampire book that I've read that really leans into this, and it's great. And it's not even really a vampire book. It's also very just vampire adjacent. winds up not being a vampire. Spoiler. It's F. Paul Wilson's The Keep, which is set in World War II. People might know it from its very bizarre Michael Mann movie adaptation. But in it, these Nazis take hold of a castle in Romania, and a vampiric thing starts feeding off of the soldiers that are there. The head Nazi in charge of the keep then drags this Jewish professor there to try and figure out what's going on, because he's familiar with local lore. And this professor notices that crosses affect the monster in a negative way. The monster hates crosses. And it does send him into something of an emotional tailspin, into like a personal crisis. Like, what does it mean that works? And like, my artifacts don't work. So just as table setting, like that was something I was interested in examining. Again, Salem's Lot, I fucking adore. And all you have to do is like put 2 tongue depressors in a cross shape, and it works. It's just, there's just something interesting about the things that are taken for granted of in a vampire story. So I wanted to write, to echo what you so aptly pointed out as a major theme in this book, isolation. I wanted to write about something where, as someone from a non-hegemonic culture anyway, you're used to this feeling of isolation. Now, what is that like in a monster story where we tend to think of one religion or culture being the hero anyway, and you're not that? Now you're even more isolated. That's where it started from. And as I was writing this book, which was, during 2021 and 2022, various drafts of it, like that's also when the anti-Semitism, which is never at zero, but like it was just like getting louder and louder and louder in this country. And that started really affecting how I was writing this story, and how like I couldn't leave it out. If I'm writing about contemporary issues and fears and stuff like that, like I have to go into this. And, I started becoming fascinated by how a lot of classic anti-Semitic tropes are very vampiric. Even leaving aside like Eastern European sort of menace that a lot of vampires and a lot of, especially like Ashkenazi Jews like myself, tend to overlap. There was this feeling of most anti-Semitic stereotypes are Jews don't belong here. They are this small parasitic group that like kind of sneaks into the shadows and like puppet masters and mind controls. And then you get into like the blood libel sort of things of like the Jews use Christian blood for their rituals so that they can be like darkly magic and stuff like that. It's Dracula shit. Like you are there and you can hypnotize people and you suck their blood and you run things and just all these sort of tropes. And New York City is looked at as a very Jewish city for obvious reasons. It's like one of the highest concentrations of Jews in the world. I think second only to Israel, if I remember correctly, to the point where a lot of bigots and stuff like that will call it Jew York City. And we're looked at as being this small group, this cabal that controlled the real estate market and the banking market, the 2 biggest markets in New York City. So we're looked at as, again, bloodsuckers within our own city, within this place that we've tried to set up our home. So that dynamic kept recurring over and over again, this weird relationship between Jews and vampires. There was even a columnist who I cannot stand because I do not agree with him on most issues, but even he like caused a little flap where I might be misremembering this, but I think I remember it correctly, that he's also Jewish and was called a bedbug at one point by a critic. And there was a conversation, a discourse that sprung up around that of, is that anti-Semitic? Because you're calling this Jewish person a bedbug, a bloodsucker, because it's just so recurrent in so much anti-Semitic shit. And so I just couldn't not let that inform what had originally just been like, what would a Jewish vampire story look like? All of which is to say then, like, I knew these couldn't be typical vampires. I knew these couldn't be proper vampires. Like, these have to be their own creature. And I borrow from certain mythologies and Jewish mythology and stuff like that to the creature that we eventually discuss in Nestlings, let's say. But it is very much informed by just the sort of anti-Semitic monster, the monster that a lot of anti-Semites are thinking of. And so there's just a lot of blood-sucking imagery throughout. There's also bedbug imagery and parasitic imagery and stuff like that, all of which I wanted to serve that central thesis that you've already nailed of isolation, and how like we think we're so comfortable now, we think we're so advanced, we think we're so technologically set, and like you're literally living in the most congested city in the country, surrounded by 8 million people. The noise is nonstop, but you're so fucking alone. And what is scarier than that? There's nothing scarier than realizing that your totems, your things you think you can fight the monster, your version of the crucifix actually doesn't work and doesn't protect you from what you think is after you. And to the point where, like, because I love, if you haven't guessed, I love subversion. I love subverting expectations and stuff like that. And this is walking close to spoiler territory, but I'm going to avoid it as best I can. But even the central character, Anna's relationship with disability, winds up subverting itself because the whole emotional journey that she goes through, I very much wanted to take a character who is vulnerable and who, has certain physical realities that she has to contend with. And I wanted to set her early in that journey. Like, she's someone who is a very athletic person. She used to be a dancer. She used to be a physical trainer. So she doesn't have any of the emotional coping mechanisms that she used to have. She's very embittered by this disability. She's not like this angelic disabled character of just, I can do no wrong. Like, I don't mind what I'm going through. Like, this is fine. Every day's a gift. Like, I wanted her to be fucking depressed and upset about dealing with this.
It's fresh.
Yeah, but by the end, you can't say that like her disability becomes her superpower or something like that. No, what happens is she realizes her disability doesn't define her. She's not defined by this thing that people think makes her less than. She is so much more than this, and it winds up becoming just another thing that this character lives with and deals with. And I very much wanted to make sure that the labels we go into this book with and the preconceptions we go into this book with, whether it's disability, whether it's Jewish, whether it's vampire, by the end of the book, they all have been subverted and questioned and, kind of re-examined and metamorphosed into something new.
It sounds like so many of the other things that you grapple with in the book are drawing on personal experience, but you are an able-bodied person. I am also, most of the book is from this wheelchair-bound perspective. There's little embodied elements that you bring to it that really feel deeply researched or very personal.
Yeah, I'm huge on research and things like that. And it's interesting too, because my last book, Mary, and that's in first person present tense, like it's a very in-depth dive into this central character's experiences. And it's all about her going through perimenopause, which is another thing like I have not gone through. And so it was very important to me to make sure I kept it as authentic as possible. So for Nestlings, I had a lot of conversations with one woman in particular, God bless her, at the Christopher and Dana Reeve Foundation, which is all about spinal injury and stuff like that. She walked me through a lot of stuff and was really great at answering all my questions. And I made sure to have a couple of sensitivity readers throughout the drafts. And one nice thing about our modern age too is that there's a lot of great stuff on like YouTube and things like that of pages that are specifically designed, especially for people who are like finding themselves now in a wheelchair, like people who didn't need a wheelchair at first. And like, so the adjustments that you have to make and the emotional adjustments you have to make and physical adjustments you have to make. And so I wanted to make sure I honored that as much as I possibly could. Same for the experiences of postpartum depression, which is another like thing that Anna is having to deal with. I mean, it's fascinating. You do all the work you can, like it's the least you can do is try and honor these experiences that another human being has to go through, and not condescend to them and not bring like your preconceptions to them. And even then, I almost got in trouble with my publishers because we'd been through like 3 major drafts of the book. We'd been through copy edits. We'd been through the edits to the copy edits. And we were in the final like layout draft of the book where I was just supposed to make like little like formatting tweaks. And like, if there was a sentence here or there that I wanted to tweak, that's all I should be doing. And I was rereading this book, which has been read by several people by this point, which I've read God knows how many times by this point, and I was just picturing something, and I was like, that's not right. Like what I just described is something I was just not thinking about as an able-bodied person. This would have required more steps for her, like, and things that she would have had to think about. And so I had to like add whole paragraphs into the manuscript and beg for forgiveness because I was like, this doesn't honor that granular experience that this needs. You and I spoke off mic at the very beginning of this conversation about our relationship with medicine and medical professionals and our family and stuff like that. My mom was in medicine. She was a physician's assistant. My dad was also a physician's assistant. So there were just medical textbooks around me all the time growing up. And I was really obsessed with the body and physical life and what that means and that experience. And as an actor too, my training is very body bound, and you listen to your body and your body informs the emotions and all that stuff. How do I look? How do I move? How do I do this? What gesture signifies what? And so I've just always kind of been fascinated by the physical effects on emotional states and vice versa. With Mary and with Nestlings, like those granular details actually wind up becoming so important because they're the landscape that this story is being told through. Almost more important than like the physical room you're in is the physical body you're inhabiting.
You really hit the nail on the head for me with your description of the physical landscape. You've got New York, you've got architecture, classicism and society, anti-Semitism, marital strife, religious doubt, and there's a million other things going on in this book that are functioning at a very high level, but at its core, it is the landscape of this woman's body. Which is nestled inside the building, which is nestled inside a city, which is in itself nestled inside a society. God damn.
No, I was even delighted that you mentioned the short inner chapters because I was specifically thinking of skylines with that. Like, so each little chapter is like its own little tiny building sort of thing. Similar to Mary, there's an afterword to this book where I kind of go into what was going on in my life as I was writing it. Another habit of Stephen King obsession, I guess, is that I always want to autobiographize my works. But I think both Mary and Nestlings kind of warrant it because a lot of big shit was happening at the time of writing these books. Nestlings was very much inspired by my wife and I had this similarly just phenomenally catastrophic year of 2021 where like it began with her mom dying in January and then 13 days later my mom died and then a couple of weeks later one of her best friends died and then a few months later our dog and our cat died on the same weekend and then a big professional thing for me fell apart and then by December out of the blue my dad died. So like just our whole family was just like wiped off the board. That alone was horrific, as you would imagine, and traumatizing and also like weirdly funny a lot of times.
Well, it's absurd.
It's totally absurd. Yeah, by the time my dad died, it was like, of course he was going to die.
Yeah.
My mom has been dealing with health issues my entire life. I knew she was going to die. We've been preparing for that for decades. My dad, none of that stuff. But of course, yeah, why not? Why wouldn't he die in 2021? Like everybody's dying in 2021. But throughout all of this, my wife was also almost entirely bedridden because she was dealing with this mystery chronic pain that we could not get diagnosed. She went to like 40 something doctors. Nobody could figure out what it was. And so like we're dealing with all these traumas and all, you know, this is also like still during the height of the pandemic in New York City and our industries are falling apart. We're not making any money acting because nothing is happening. Like we're trying to find health insurance. Like it's just all like terrifying. But it was really clarifying in an unpleasant way, but in an undeniable way that the body is still the most important thing. Because like if that is not doing what you need it to do, you can't do all the other things that you need to do. Like you can't mourn the losses you're having while your body is also in shrieking white hot pain. So that's a lot of where this book comes from, is her experiences. Obviously I'm not trying to speak for her, but just like my experiences of her experiences and like what it was like to just have your body take precedence over all the other important things that are happening, to not be able to negotiate with it at all. Like your body's not going to give you a fucking grief day to like go deal with your mom's death or your dad's death or anything like that. And then also my own experiences in that context, because our pets were incredibly old and needy. And so I was running on like 4 hours of sleep a night for like 18 months. I'd never been so just like long-term sleep deprived, and it was fucking me up. That was my physical thing that I was dealing with, was just the realities of sleep deprivation, prolonged sleep deprivation. And then also like what it's like to be a caregiver and the various beautiful or sometimes selfish and ugly feelings that you can have as a caretaker. And, you know, those complexities, again, just talking about like subverting definitions and roles and stuff like that. And the character of Reed goes through some pretty big changes in that respect, and you know, the resentment and the helplessness and all of that stuff. Because again, you got your Google will give you some advice, but like Google's not going to wake up every 2 hours and do what needs to be done. Like Google's not going to save you, as you so rightly said. So yeah, so like those things were all very much active in the telling of this story.
Your story and your afterword, which is called 2021, grapples not just with grief, because as a society, we're all dealing with grief from the pandemic and Trump and a million other slights, but also fatalism and nihilism.
Mm-hmm.
You know, on the other side of grief, there's nihilism. You can push through grief just through sheer will or denial, but you cannot push through nihilism with denial. Your book and the afterword almost meant as much to me in equal parts. Obviously, coming to the afterword after experiencing the book was even more profound, but just on its own, as an open letter to America in 2023, I think 2021 deserves to be shared and circulated. I would hate for anyone to skip the book, so please don't. However, just as a personal autobiographical essay, it's fucking phenomenal. And I had mentioned in an email that, you know, it really floored me. You say in your afterward that everyone has probably experienced something like 2021. And I told you that my wife and I had. You know, the timeline's a little screwy because when you're under stress, you don't form memories properly. Cortisol interrupts with memory formation. And so the last few years are literally a blur for me. We were at the end of our journey. A lot of that story is not mine to tell. I will be omitting parts of that. For the podcast, I picked 2 little short passages. Would you be up for reading them?
Sure. It's a book about change, and it's a book about grief, essentially change's hangover. It's a book of liminal spaces, because as 2021 taught me, that's what grief is. Grief is the space between 2 states of being, who you were and who you are. I think healing begins when you finally recognize there is no moving on, only moving forward. You don't actually leave anything behind. You carry it with you. That's why the process of healing can feel so slow. You're carrying more weight now.
Beautifully said. Much appreciated. And
thank you.
I cannot recommend this book enough. I think people are probably beginning to get the gist in our 5-part epic interview.
Hell yeah. Oh, and words are fucking meaningless, however pretty they can be in response to things like that. But I'm so sorry for all that you had to go through and for your recent one as well. I mean, that's one of the reasons why horror, I think, is such a, not to suddenly sound like I'm trivializing it, but quite the opposite. One of the reasons why I think horror for me is such a lifeboat is because life is fucking brutal a lot of the time. And there's something weirdly comforting about this 2-pronged sort of experience of, if you're at a place where you are even able to sit down and read and enjoy a story, things could always be worse. So just thank God for stories and books anyway. But especially when you're reading a story about people who probably can't sit down and read a book because they're going through something that's maybe worse than what you're going through. There's something very cathartic about that and important about that. You know, there's a reason some of our earliest stories are horror stories, even when life was unimaginably difficult to live through.
Or some of our traditions and holidays are horror stories.
Yeah.
For those in the Jewish persuasion.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking of Halloween, your titular holiday. But yeah, no, it's true. Because you reference nihilism, which I think is such a tremendous danger and such a pitfall that individuals and societies can fall into, especially in the wake of great tragedies. I, on the other hand, identify as an existentialist, which I think is I would posit to say, the healthier version of nihilism, which to me, the difference is nihilism is nothing matters, so it doesn't matter what you do, fucking do anything. But existentialism is nothing matters, so what you do is all you have. It's the most important thing. And find as much meaning as you can in the moments where things aren't falling apart. We are, as far as we know, the only creatures who are aware that they're going to die. And we have to walk around and put on pants and do a job and, find ways to entertain ourselves when in the back of our minds, it's just we're gonna die and we have split the atom and yet we have no idea what happens after we die. We can have strong beliefs, but nobody fucking knows for sure. And like, we just have to live with that knowledge and pay bills. And so I find something incredibly profound about horror as a genre and as a coping mechanism and as a lens through which to see things. So I'm grateful to people like you who read and like to talk about it.
I share your outlook. Are you ready to wrap it up with some good old-fashioned Halloween questions?
Let's do it.
All right. Being a son of Arizona, have you ever heard of the Red Ghost?
The Red Ghost. That rings a very faint bell, but I don't know why. So probably not.
Stop me if you heard this one. In the late 19th century, the Red Ghost haunted the Arizona frontier. It was a large red camel with a bleached human skeleton on its back.
Ooh, no, I don't think I have heard this.
So the Army formed the U.S. Camel Corps. They imported camels to serve as pack animals in the brutal American West to travel across the desert, deal with the climate, etc. And then when the Civil War kicked off, the camels were either sold off or abandoned. Decades after, there were just camels out wandering the American Midwest. Legends of the Red Ghost started to spread across Arizona. In 1883, the Red Ghost allegedly trampled a woman to death, leaving nothing behind but giant hoofprints and red hair. After that, it was observed knocking over wagons, killing and devouring a grizzly bear. Cowboys with lassos and posses with guns failed to bring down the beast, but it was eventually felled by a single shot when it wandered into a farmer's yard in 1893. That is the tale of the Red Ghost.
Oh, I love it. Oh, I'm going to steal that for something.
Feel free.
What a great image.
Did you celebrate Halloween growing up?
I did. Yeah, I love Halloween.
What were some of your all-time best or worst Halloweens?
I don't have a lot of particular memories of Halloween. I have like limbic memories of Halloween. Walking around, the moon is up, the sky in the desert, nothing is like it. And so just like this expansive sky. And I always think of a full moon because I guess I'm a Ray Bradbury fan at heart. But like, that's just what I picture. And, wispy clouds in front of it and like walking around the neighborhood, actually interacting with neighbors for the only time that year, because otherwise you have absolutely no reason to. Yeah, I love walking around at night in the desert anyway. And so like this was just like the perfect opportunity. And the people are dressed in scary costumes and there's scary display. Like it's just my absolute favorite time of year. And I think part of it is because like I have such rich emotional contentedness attached to it as a kid. Somebody articulated this on Twitter and it really struck a chord in me where they were like, I realized that I actually don't love Halloween because Halloween means the end of Halloween. I love all of October leading up to Halloween the most. And I get that feeling like, because Halloween is when the shit comes down. And that's like, then you're just stuck in November. Who likes November? But like October, when like people are putting those decorations up and every store is just full of skeletons and masks and stuff like that. Oh, I love it.
That's why I'm a big champion of Dia de los Muertos.
Yes. Yeah.
You get to extend the Halloween season for 2 or 3 more days.
Mm-hmm.
And you get to deepen your appreciation of the reason for the season. It's a memento mori. So what do you do to celebrate Halloween now that you're adult in New York City?
We just moved to an apartment in a neighborhood that is we're still in Queens, we're still in New York City, but like we're on a block that is very suburban feeling. So like they take it very seriously, which is really nice. So like we were giving out candy for hours last year after having like not had to do anything for Halloween pretty much ever as an adult. So that was really nice. They close off the block and it's just like a bunch of kids coming for candy. But my wife hates horror. She responds to horror the way like I respond to roller coasters, which I just won't do. I just don't fuck with them. I hate them. But in October, that's when she begrudgingly is like, all right, I'll watch some horror movies. And so that's kind of my tradition now is to like curate which ones I think will be like the least upsetting, but still effective, but maybe not too effective. But we'll scratch certain itches and get to inflict 2 to 3 of those movies on her. That's my favorite tradition right now.
That is a whole genre of podcast.
Yeah.
People either subject or invite their partner into horror. So what are you working on next?
Next, I'm like 95% done with the first draft of my next book, which I am loving in a way I don't think I've ever loved anything I've written before. Like, I'm really excited about this one. I've been excited about all of them. I'm very excited about Nestlings. I can't wait for people to read Nestlings. This book is like completely different and has just been a completely different experience. I'm purposefully trying to write something that, if Nestlings was, my homage to like 70s creeping paranoia horror, this is my homage to like 80s airport thriller horror. So it's just balls to the wall, nonstop action. It's huge body count. Without giving away too much, it combines my love of it and my love of Terminator 2. It works, trust me, but you're going to have to see how. My film and TV reps are very excited about this story as well, so they want me to turn it around and then work on the screenplay really fast so they can start shopping the screenplay.
Where can our listeners find more of your stuff?
I am trying my best to wrench myself away from Twitter, at Nat Cassidy. I'm on Instagram, Cat Cassidy, because I couldn't get my name. And then TikTok, I've been ticking more talks lately. That's also Nat Cassidy. And my website, that's also natcassidy.com.
I encourage everyone to get this book. This book drops Halloween 2023. Is it available for pre-order?
It is, yeah. Available and hungry for it.
Nat, thank you so much for coming on.
My pleasure. What a great conversation.
All right, see you, Nat.
Awesome, man. Be well.
Bye. Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find Ryan at 20th Century RG with the number 20 on YouTube. And you can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
First things first, you stretch the skin, you tap the vein, you break the skin. First things first, you stretch the skin, you tap the vein, you break the skin. He's 7 years old, his mom's a nurse. His dad'll come back someday. She works at the ward, pulling overtime. She lets him run around, 'cause he's gotta play. And it breaks her heart that she can't take him elsewhere. But she needs this job and she knows life just ain't fair. So she lets him go. First, you stretch the skin, you tap the vein, you break the skin. First things first, you stretch the skin, you tap the vein, you break the skin. He's learned the terrain, he knows the maps, which rooms he can use, to avoid, which doors he can pick, which closets are stocked with all the things that he needs to be enjoyed. The first room he sees, Mrs. Albemarle, the one who his mom said was oh so rude. He watches her eat and he smiles to himself, 'cause he poured a bottle of bleach into her food. There's another old man, the one who wakes with a jolt. He's like a jack-in-the-box, all of the nurses said. So he takes a belt, makes it tight around the neck, and attaches it to the back of the bed. First things first, you stretch the skin, tap the vein, break the skin, but it's all in good fun. He's a kid, you know, kids will have their way.
we've done it. We found the limit of my bladder.
Yeah.